Hello, Dig Nation. Welcome to the first Dig South Fall Confab, the virtual event where experts present to a live audience of executives, entrepreneurs, investors, and other Dig Nation members. For those of you joining us for the first time today, Dig Nation is the South's tech tribe. This week, we are launching a brand new member portal at dignation.co. Check out the benefits we have on tap for you, including member profiles, a job board, events calendar, blog posts, forums, groups, courses, and much more. We know that you cannot afford to stop building valuable relationships this year. And remember, networking without interacting is just spam. So keep your network flowing in 2021 and beyond with Dig Nation, the South's tech tribe. Find out more at dignation.co. That's dignation.co. Now on with the show. My name is Stanfield Gray. I am your host and the founder of Dig South. Dig Confab is powered by Dig South, the South's first and foremost tech media and events company. We are sponsored today by Oracle for Startups. We have a great relationship with them. We connect them to all sorts of fast growth, scalable companies. They have special cloud credit deals that they would love to turn you on to. And they also provide extensive mentorship, connection to investors, and much more. So get in touch with us at info@digsouth.com if you'd like to know more about Oracle for Startups and you'd like to connect with the Oracle team. They are fantastic champions of startup growth and entrepreneurship, and they've been big supporters of Dig South throughout this tumultuous year and several years preceding this as a big part of our Dig South Tech Summit. And please be sure to join us following today's presentation at the Executive Happy Hour. You can find the Executive Happy Hour via a separate Zoom link that was included in your calendar invite. We will also post it into the comments section during and following the talk. And be bold. Do not be afraid to post questions throughout the talk today to our special guest. Speak of the devil, today we are joined by Jim Anderson, CEO of SocialFlow. SocialFlow uses real-time data and business rules to determine what and when to publish to your social media properties for both owned and paid social posts. More than half of the world's 150 top media companies rely on SocialFlow to distribute their content to social networks such as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You know the others. Their clients include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Reuters, BBC, Cox Media, Condé Nast, Meredith, and many more. Our new friend Jim Anderson has more than a decade of experience working with high growth companies and social media platforms and helped lead Vitru's successful exit to Oracle in 2012 for more than $300 million. Jim is a recognized thought leader in the social marketing space and frequent guest on CNN, Fox, Bloomberg, MSNBC, and many others. He'll draw on that experience and data from more than 1 trillion social impressions generated by SocialFlow's blue chip media clients as he shares his thoughts on social media and the election and offers insights that will last well beyond this election season. So welcome to the Dig South Fall Confab, Jim. First question, are you going to also share all 1 trillion insights today?
Thanks, Stan. I don't know that I'm going to have time to share all trillion impressions, but I'll get through as much as I can in a brief period of time today. And it is great to be here. Super excited. As you mentioned, I live in New York City now. And by the way, this is a photoshopped image I grabbed from the internet. The Statue of Liberty does not sit in front of Lower Manhattan that way. I am, I guess, a New Yorker now, if I recognize those kind of things. But I haven't been here that long. As Stan mentioned, I have connections to the South. My father was born in Mississippi. I was born and lived 15 years in Alabama. And I lived 31 years in Georgia, still own a house there before ending up back in New York City. So never really too far from the South, far physically, but not far emotionally right now. And I'm a huge fan of the startup scene, what Dig South is doing, and just in general, what startups are doing in the South. Super excited to see the progress there. The Oracle for Startup folks as well. I know many of those folks from my previous life as well. So, but enough about me and about that. Let's dive in to the topic of today. You may have heard that there's an election coming up next week. Who knew? I'm not sure how you could possibly even miss that. So social media platforms clearly are in the thick of it right now. Your Facebook, most notably, Twitter and others as well, are right smack in the middle of the whole thing here. And what you get from the left here, these criticisms about social platforms, the platforms are not doing enough to take down lies on social social media is one of the common criticisms you hear. And then on the right, you hear, the platforms are censoring content from conservatives and exercising their own editorial judgment. And you get those two things sort of colliding, and a level of intensity that's really coming to bear. You see congressional hearings that we had today. You see lots of criticisms, and that doesn't seem likely to change. The election may be over, at least we hope it will be next week, but these issues are going to continue to exist for a long time into the future, and the social media platforms are right in the thick of it. And there's many other complaints as well. It's not just election related, and it's not just about censorship and lies. So there's a lot of questions still to be answered. A lot of people think social media platforms, or more broadly tech companies, are too big and they should be broken up. They think they're too monopolistic. The antitrust scrutiny has certainly already come for Google, rumored to be coming for Facebook. And I think if you're a big tech company, antitrust scrutiny is inevitable for you. And not just in the US, by the way, in the EU and other places around the world. So all of big tech is having to wrestle with that as well. But I'm not here to criticize or defend. I'm not going to take an advocacy position. I'm not going to criticize or defend Facebook, which, by the way, my daughter, who's 15, says, Dad, you do realize Facebook's only for old people. And she says, Twitter, as far as Twitter, Instagram's so much better than Twitter. And I finally got her, and I said, hey, but Teresa, my Facebook owns Instagram, you do realize. And so that was the crushing revelation to the 15-year-old who had no idea that Instagram was a part of the larger Facebook umbrella. So, but I do, as Stan mentioned, work with the platforms professionally. I have worked with them for many, many years. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Pinterest, they are the ones that we currently support more than 12 years. I think Facebook was the first one we started working with back in the days of Vitru. And as Stan mentioned, Vitru was an Atlanta-based company that was acquired in 2012 by Oracle. So great exit. Great. I spent a year as an Oracle employee, as I mentioned. And then after doing that, joined SocialFlow and moved to New York for the opportunity. So we are a software company. We're venture backed. So I understand, the importance of revenue. When Andrea said revenue, I perked up in my chair, just like you probably did as well. If you're in the startup scene, revenue is sort of everything. That's what sort of demonstrates that you have traction. That's what attracts funding, all those kinds of things. And we do work for media customers, which, as Stan ran through a list of them here, I won't repeat them all, but you can see many of the logos we work with. These are high volume content creators. That's sort of a bunch more of them. And you can see these are the people who produce a tremendous amount of content and put it out on social channels. Our clients have about 10,000. I think it's more like 12,000 social properties. So Facebook page, Twitter handle, Pinterest page, Instagram page, et cetera. You add them all up, it's more than 10,000 of those social properties. About 30,000 employees of those organizations log into our software to help manage various elements of the distribution of that content. And it's about 50 million social posts per year that generate about 12 billion consumer clicks. So that's about 1 billion clicks a month, and more than 1 trillion in social reach per year. So Stanfield mentioned that trillion number. I mean, we've got a massive amount of reach by virtue of these wonderful media companies that we work with, who put their content to our platform. And that puts us in a really unique position. And just to reiterate there, if you're sort of wanting to see all those numbers together, yeah, million, billion, trillion is the right way to think about it. 1 trillion in reach, millions of posts, and billions in the middle in terms of the clicks that come back through our platform. So that creates a really interesting signal, which is really all about consumer attention, right? We've got this signal of what people are paying attention to on social. What kinds of stories are they clicking on? What are the patterns? What stories are resonating? What are not? And by the way, 80% of those clicks, or taps more accurately, are on mobile, right? A social story is by definition a mobile story, right? That's what mobile, sort of mobile is the dominant consumption pattern. Even in the pandemic, I haven't seen the latest statistic. My guess is it probably dropped at maybe 75% or 70% of social consumption is now on mobile. But once we get back into a more normal situation, I'd expect that number to get back up to 80%, maybe even more, as we use our mobile devices for more and more. So you go back and say, wow, we've got 1 billion clicks a month on some of the best content in the world by the best media companies in the world, put out on social at scale. And so we get a really unique signal. And I'm going to share some of that in a little bit with you as it specifically relates to the election. Before I get into the data, though, let's talk a little bit more specific about the good, the bad, and the ugly with these social platforms. So the good, let's start with that, because there is some good there, and I do think, I'm not here to advocate or defend, but I do think it's important to have a balanced view. And yes, there's plenty to criticize, but there's also some good stuff, and let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I saw this literally came up in my Facebook feed yesterday. I won't read the entire thing to you, but I'll leave it up here for a minute. And it was somebody, believe it or not, I actually don't even know her well. She's the spouse of a former colleague of mine. I've anonymized her, obviously, but she sort of put a very heartfelt post out on Facebook. And of course, if you're on Facebook at all, you know there's so much election content. There's a lot of angry people and hurt feelings and all kinds of things going on. So it was a really heartfelt post that she was putting out to her friends, just to try to sort of create that sense of community and say that she really appreciated what people were putting out there, and that that last line, or the next to last line. I'm sorry. Next, if you're my Facebook friend, it's because I see in you qualities that I would like to see in myself. When I saw that, I'm like, wow, that's a pretty personal statement out on a very seemingly impersonal platform. But that's the kind of good thing that you can see on these social platforms, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, or any others. A little bit less significant, birthday wishes. You may have gotten birthday wishes on Facebook. That's always nice. I got some. And because I'm an engineer by education, I don't know if Stan mentioned that, but I'm an engineer, so I think like an engineer, and I'm prone to chart or graph darn near anything. And so last year when I got birthday wishes, I don't know what got me thinking about it, but I actually sat down and I counted them all up. I had 40 or so birthday wishes from people. And I was trying to think, hey, when was the last time I saw that person? And there's a whole lot of people, right down here on the bottom of the x-axis. These are people I see all the time. I see on a daily basis. My family, who wish me a happy birthday on Facebook, whatever. People I've seen more, recently. There's 10 or so of those, and that's appreciated. But if they hadn't said that on Facebook, they probably would have wished me in person or on by phone or something else. Then you get up to people who I haven't seen in more than a year or so, or 2 or 5. And it's like, okay, these are people who I know and I like, or at least, we have something in common. Maybe we work together. Maybe we went to school together. And we didn't stay in touch. We didn't fail to stay in touch or see each other because we didn't want to. It's just because time, circumstance. I live in a different city now. We have families. People get busy. All the things that happen in life that sort of keep you from seeing people as often as you might like. And you sort of go up the line here and you see all the way up to 36 years as somebody I haven't seen who wished me a happy birthday on Facebook. So the overall takeaway from this chart is, yeah, Jim's kind of old, right? I mean, if I've got people on Facebook I haven't seen in 36 years, just to be clear, I have not been Facebook friends with them for 36 years, but I haven't seen them in 36 years. And 19 people who I haven't seen in more than a decade. That's kind of interesting. It's like, well, wow. I got to thinking about that and thinking about each of those individual people. Probably the majority of them were coworkers down here that I used to work with at Mindspring and Earthlink in Atlanta. I don't know what was happening in this period between 20 and 30 years. I guess I wasn't a very sociable person, or not staying in touch with people. And then these are people I either went to high school with, or in this case, this was the younger brother of one of my best friends from childhood. Who I know, but I literally haven't seen him in 36, 37 years at this point. And he wished me a happy birthday on Facebook. I thanked him. I appreciated that. And I know just a little bit about his life because he's in my Facebook newsfeed periodically that I wouldn't know otherwise. So it's sort of interesting. And your graphs may or may not look like this. And obviously the longer you've lived, the more people you've known, the more need for this kind of thing you might have. Which may be why my daughter says, hey, Facebook's only for old people, is, you can sort of see these kinds of trends. And this is the 4 people who I haven't seen in more than 30 years. It's just sort of really striking to me. So enough of the math and the charts and all that. I mean, the good is really all about the power of staying connected. That's been Facebook's marketing tagline for a long time, is a connected world, and the power of helping human connections, those kinds of things, and knowing things about people's lives made possible by this algorithmic feed that's become increasingly popular and was a topic of some of the testimony this morning in front of the Senate. Facebook has long used algorithmic feeds. Google does the same thing as it relates to YouTube. Twitter was late to the algorithmic feed game, but they use algorithms. And that's just a sort of a fancy, computer sciencey term for, in my mind, something that gives you more of what you like and less of what you don't, right? When people say, oh, algorithms, and you sort of get into this all technical speak about it, that's fine. There's a time and place for the technical conversation. But, who doesn't want more of what they like and less of what they don't, right? If I'm consuming content in my Twitter feed or my Facebook feed or on YouTube or wherever else, I mean, I want it tailored to me. It's more likely to be interesting. And who wants to sit there and try to sift through a whole bunch of stuff that's irrelevant to look for stuff that's relevant? So it's really kind of an amazing thing that these algorithms have gotten so good at serving us content that's interesting to us, that we want to see. I mean, it's the analogy I use is a little bit like eating chocolate cake for dinner every night, right? I mean, it's like, wow, that's amazing. I love chocolate cake, so why wouldn't I want it for dinner every day? which is maybe a good segue into the negative side. If you eat cake for dinner every day, it's probably not going to turn out that well for you. And so you now end up in the bad and the ugly side of social, is these algorithmic feeds are constantly giving you more and more content that you're interested in, that you want to see. That doesn't always mean it's good for you, especially in the quantities in which it's served, very much like the chocolate cake analogy. So that content tailored to me can ultimately create a filter bubble, or many filter bubbles, right? Where you start to see things in a very funhouse mirror sort of way, right? It's not, you're not getting an accurate view of the world because you're just seeing content that's relevant to you, that maybe provokes your emotions or does things that, sort of makes you react. And sort of by virtue of how it works, it tends to reward the strongest emotions, right? Things that make you happy, or things that make you sad, or things that make you angry. And I think we all intuitively know that anger is one of the strongest emotions. And so what you end up with is this algorithmic feed. When you think about tens of thousands and then millions and then billions of these things time after time after time, that tends to amplify and maybe over index on the content that makes you angry or creates a strong emotional reaction in some other way. And that has real consequences and can create a real vicious cycle, where again, you're sort of distorting your view of the world based on the content that Facebook, or to a lesser degree, Twitter or YouTube or some other platforms are serving you with these algorithmic feeds. That can lead to very much the spread of misinformation. Right now, we're into the situation where you get a filter bubble and there's misinformation, and we're now really actually just starting to question reality, and we don't have a shared set of facts. And that's where things really get ugly. And there's a lot of that rhetoric going on in and around the election. There's a lot of substance to the rhetoric. I won't sit here and take a position on any of that, but it's a really challenging problem, and it's a societal problem that's, I don't know if it starts with the social networks, but they certainly are a major contributor to it. And so that when you see people get really upset, I think that's a good chunk of the reason behind it, is it's really turned into an ugly situation. You get people forwarding things they haven't even read. It's emotion driven, not necessarily logic driven. This makes me angry, and it just sort of reinforces what I think, and I'm just going to forward it along. I didn't read it, I didn't think about it critically. I just forwarded it along. It reinforces what I already believe, and I want the rest of the world to know that. Whether it's true or not is sort of a different question. And I like to call some of those folks, you may have some of them in your news feed as well, misinformation super spreaders, right? They are the ones that, if there's something that's questionable out there circulating, it's probably going to come from them. I have a few of those in my feed, and you just know they haven't sort of read or stopped to think about it, and then you try to debunk them, the myths that are being spread, and so good luck with that. I think it's important that we try to do that, but it's really hard when people are spreading that kind of information. Again, it tends to be very emotion driven, not very logic driven. The other thing about misinformation is very ephemeral, right? It's like trying to measure smoke, right? How do you measure misinformation? It's constantly changing and moving and shifting. And it's very difficult to get your arms around. It's very difficult for Facebook and Twitter and Google to get their arms around misinformation too. And not the least of which is every person's social feed is unique, and regrettably, misinformation is not universally defined. Is it misinformation or is it truth telling, right? Sometimes that's a matter of perspective. I am a big fan of objective facts. I do think there are a lot of objective facts in the world that people may or may not want to admit, but my view of objective facts may differ from Stan's view of objective facts. And there's kind of this famous saying out there, alternative facts, which was made by Kellyanne Conway, famously, a White House counselor. And I'm not going to take a political position here. I just want to illustrate, sort of how this conversation ends up going. I think what Kellyanne Conway was trying to say when she talked about alternative facts was facts that tell a story different than what you're telling. What the folks, I think, primarily on the left said is, you're trying to talk about facts that may or may not be true, but that make your point, right? And I'm not going to render a judgment about which facts are really facts, what points of view are better or worse. But we end up in these situations where you sort of imagine this kind of situation amplified 1 billion times on Facebook, and that's effectively what we've got going on right now. And all that brings us to the election, right? So coming up next week, election day or election counting day, people have even sort of to struggle with, calling it election day because there's so much early voting. It's really the day the votes start being counted, or the day the votes are counted, because in some states they're already counting. So you sort of end up tied up in some of the taxonomy here. But let's dive in and talk a little bit about the election. I'm going to go back to the 1 billion clicks a month or so in data that we see. So just so you understand, all of those posts that come through SocialFlow, we run through a taxonomy engine, and we categorize them about what they are. Is this sports? tennis, Serena Williams? Is this politics, presidential election, Joe Biden? Those types of things. And then we have a bunch of keywords as well. And all of those 50 million or so stories are run through a taxonomy engine. And then every time clicks come through, we can tabulate the clicks, of course, on a per story basis, but we can also tabulate them on a per topic basis. Hey, how popular is Serena Williams right now in terms of click traffic on the stories that flow through SocialFlow? What's going on as it relates to the election? And it ends up with some very interesting insights. And when you start with 1 billion clicks a month, you end up with a pretty amazing signal that you can segment in some really interesting ways. So all kinds of content, as I mentioned. I will say that our client base consists of reputable media, and I put reputable in quotes because, again, reputability is a subjective judgment. I think all of our clients are reputable in that they're professional media organizations that hold themselves to a certain standard. But some are, more provocative than others, and maybe even some are not as reputable in your eyes. I mean, that's sort of again a subjective judgment. But they certainly are professional media organizations that have retained a tool and a technology like SocialFlow, using a software license to get their content out to Facebook, Twitter, and other social platforms. So that, again, I'm not talking about the misinformation super spreaders, right? I mean, I'm talking about media companies and what they put out. So that's the signal that we're getting ready to talk about, and I'm going to show you here. And I will mention on that reputable media, sort of left, right, center, they are all over the place, right? So we have, I'm not going to name names because even that is subjective, but we have outlets that you would stereotypically call on the left. We have outlets you would stereotypically call on the right, and everywhere in between. So plenty of variety of signal. There are various narratives about the media and whether it's left-leaning or not. But we've got a pretty wide swath of media companies represented in our signal. So that makes me pretty comfortable that what we're presenting is actually a pretty interesting and representative insight on these election topics. So that said, let's dive in. How do you know what's important? Well, there's a lot of people who do this professionally for a living, so we're not trying to recreate the wheel. We went to Pew Research and we looked at some of their research, and they said, okay, these are the 10 or 12 topics that voters say are most important to them, and economy was listed as number one. And this was back in late July and August, so it may have shifted a little bit over time, but it gives us some major categories. The numbers aren't as important to us. The voters say the economy is the most important, and at least in this list that abortion is the least important. Whether that ends up being true when they vote is open to interpretation and further study, and whether people's media consumption habits mirror that is also an interesting point, and that's what we're really focusing on. So those were the major categories that we looked at, and we wanted to see how the media consumption of those topics compared to what people said was important to them. So this is the first of many charts and graphs. A lot going on here. We picked the top 4 just because all the rest of them were very close to the bottom of the y-axis there. It wouldn't really add much. But it turns out people said the economy was the most important thing to them in the election. But if you just judge by their media consumption, coronavirus is by far the most important topic to them. And that big giant spike in early October, that's when the president was diagnosed with coronavirus. So obviously a big spike there because every story about President Trump at that point became a coronavirus story for that period of time. And then it sort of dampened down, back down. If I go back and look at the data in September, it's not presented here, but it was pretty similar, right? It was way more significant than all the other topics. And in fact, it was so much more significant that if you take that Pew Research list and you take every category in there of our click traffic that we measure, again, let's go with about 1 billion clicks a month. Coronavirus content, of all the content that fit any one of those categories, coronavirus was 76%, and all the other categories combined was 24%. So people said the economy was really the most important thing to them, and it may very well be, and that may be what drives their vote when they walk into the ballot box or mail their ballot or drop it off. But at least from their media consumption, coronavirus is a huge issue. It is on their mind. It is in the news. It is what they're clicking on, reading, watching, consuming, way more than those other topics. So how that affects votes, that's the subject of a research project that maybe can be started next week. We can go back and look at our data and see how predictive it was and how it compared or contrasted. I'm sure there are plenty of insights to be drawn there, and with the benefit of hindsight and research, there's quite a bit that could be mined from that. So plenty of interesting clues from that 1 billion data points. Just to clarify what we're talking about with that 1 billion, these are consumer clicks. So typically from somebody's mobile device, because remember 80% of social consumption is from mobile, they are geolocated by state, right? So if I click on a story that was published by SocialFlow in my Twitter feed, it'll go back and it'll come back as a New York State click, right? And even a New York City click. So geolocated in a broad geography. And then we actually go and we sort of index that by population. So you can get a per capita click, right? The least populous states are, of course, going to have less clicks than California and New York. But if you want to understand what's going on a per capita basis, you can index it by population. So that's what we did with the data. And I've got a number of maps that look like this that I'm going to share with you. And I'm going to slow down a little bit here and leave this up because there's a lot to digest. I didn't label the states. So I guess the first thing you can say is this is a geography test. Can you remember all your states? I even had to go back and check in a few of them if it makes you feel any better. Some of them are obvious, obviously, in the South, where I presume this audience tends to be over-indexed. Georgia, where I lived for 31 years, Alabama, where I was born, Mississippi, where my father's from, they tend to, be a little bit lighter. And then actually even more so when you get over into Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And that's actually a pretty consistent theme throughout the rest of these charts. You'll see those 4 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, tend to be pretty light on content consumption on a per capita basis. So again, it's not this that they don't have as many people, it's just on a per capita basis. For whatever reason, they're not consuming as much content on these topics. It may mean they're interested in other things. It may mean that they're just not clicking as much. Maybe they don't have as much smartphone penetration, or when they are on their smartphones, they're doing something other than clicking on social media stories. So plenty of alternative explanations there. But the fact of the matter is the click traffic from those states tends to be on the low end. The thing that probably already leaped out at you, though, which is crazy, and I wish I could tell you I had the magic answer for why this is, but I don't know why there's so much interest in North Dakota on coronavirus stories. I mean, I do know there's been an outbreak. They had the Sturgis motorcycle rally, which was in South Dakota, and a lot of those people came from surrounding states. So I do know they've been experiencing spikes up there. But you'll also see North Dakota show up high on a couple of other charts as well. And so there's just tends to be an over-indexing of content consumption in North Dakota in general, and very specifically on COVID-related content. And then the darker colors that are not quite this purple are also indications of over-indexing. The numbers are not labeled here, but you can see Illinois, which contains Chicago, is definitely a pretty high. And then we get over into some of the states over here, Delaware, Rhode Island, et cetera. And then up in the Northeast more broadly, New York, New Jersey, all tend to be pretty heavy clickers on coronavirus content on a per capita basis. Not maybe as much in California, which could just be a population that could be a function of the fact that California is such a populous state that their numbers would have to be enormous. So when you normalize it on population, California is not really any different than, say, Nebraska, which is kind of an interesting observation unto itself. So lots of interesting data and insights that can be drawn from this. I will also point to Michigan and Wisconsin, 2 battleground states, and we'll get to the battleground states here in a minute. I'm sorry, that's Wisconsin, that's Minnesota next to it. So look at my geography fail right there. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But before I dive into the battleground states, I'll also point out we have data from around the world, right? We've got clients in Canada, we've got clients in the UK and across Europe. And so it's sort of interesting just to see, there's no giant revelation here when you layer on the Canadian provinces. They sort of maybe are a little bit on the lighter. They don't have anybody as intense as North Dakota or Illinois, but it's probably not materially different than most of the US there. But if you jump over to Europe, it's kind of interesting. Look at Italy, right? I mean, Italy is as dark as you can get on this chart here. Massive per capita consumption of coronavirus content in Italy. And of course, they had some really terrible times and terrible outbreaks. And then very significant in the UK and Germany as well. So again, just some very interesting data. This isn't obviously going to relate to the US election here, because presumably most of those people cannot vote in the US other than maybe absentee. But it just shows you how you can start to layer in and look at these insights and see across, this is the EU plus the UK. countries, you can start to get a sense of different patterns of content consumption, specifically as it relates to these topics. You can also, is probably not lost on you, you can extend this to other things as well. It doesn't have to be election related. It doesn't even have to be politics related. So we got a really interesting signal. You can get into sporting events or seasonal events or things that are interesting to marketers and advertisers, and really develop some really interesting insights there. But let's get back to coronavirus. Let's get back to the US. We got an election coming up next week, and battleground states are sort of what everybody's talking about. And so this is just focused in. We grade out everybody else. So let's take North Dakota. That's interesting, but I think we can reliably assume that North Dakota is going to vote red in the presidential election. So let's look at the states where there is some degree of uncertainty and see what we see there. And this one's kind of interesting as well. So Michigan and Pennsylvania are very notably over-indexed. And by the way, this is over-indexed against each other. So the colors are going to be different than the states here because we're only focusing on these 7 or 8 battleground states and not all 50. So there's different shading because we've got a different baseline that we're comparing it against. So you start to see and tease out the differences here, that Michigan and Pennsylvania are really clicking on quite a bit more coronavirus content than, say, Georgia and Arizona. Doesn't mean it's not important in Georgia or Arizona. It doesn't mean that we know what the voting is going to be, but one could reasonably surmise that, well, okay, if coronavirus content is really important in these states and generating a lot of consumer interest, and if people judge by their behavior think that's important, and if they say it's important to how they're going to choose to vote, you might be able to draw some conclusions that Michigan and Pennsylvania might break differently than Georgia, for instance, and Arizona. We'll see next week if that's in fact what ends up happening, but that's what the data at least hints at, if not suggests. And then Wisconsin and Ohio are dark in their own way, not quite as dark as Michigan and Pennsylvania. But if I were to rank these, I think the order was Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, Iowa, in descending order. So you start to get a sense. And again, Georgia and Florida, both big battleground states with a lot of electoral votes at stake. So we'll see how that plays out from a coronavirus perspective. So it gives you a flavor of the kinds of analyses we do here. And now let me shift topics here. This is mislabeled. Actually, on the left, it says coronavirus, but I'm sorry, this is an economy chart, as you can see on the top. There's not nearly as much distinction here. So the economy is important. We all, need jobs and to pay our bills and support our families. And, the economy is important to everybody, but there's just not as much separation on a state by state basis. You see a little bit of segmentation. Michigan's a little bit darker than Georgia, but it's not nearly as pronounced as the coronavirus distinction was. So what that suggests is, however important the economy is, there's not as much variability, at least across these battleground states, on the economy. And so you'll have to see how that plays out. Here's the view of the Canadian provinces again. And I included this again, not because these people vote in the US election, but because, wow, this is interesting. Now, all of a sudden you jump up to the Canadian provinces and almost all of them show significantly greater click interest in stories about the economy than do states in the US. And the one major exception to that is Quebec, right here. And my mother happened to be Canadian. She was born in Montreal. I know a little bit, and Quebec fancies itself as a very different kind of province inside of Canada. There's no small amount of separatist movement there as well. So clearly you see Quebec behaving very differently than the other provinces are behaving. Again, I make no value judgment on that. I just think it's kind of interesting to see that kind of distinction borne out. And then you go over to Ontario and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and British Columbia, you see significant, interest in the economy on a much greater per capita basis than pretty much any state in the U.S., with the possible exception, I think New Jersey might be about the same as those, but by and large, just very, very different. And then just by contrast, the Supreme Court, which again, way more of an American topic than a Canadian topic, but you see that's not, it's not like all Canadians are interested in all topics, not surprisingly, they're just not as interested in the Supreme Court as US citizens are, because it doesn't affect them in nearly the same way. So just an interesting contrast when you look at the different topics and you start to see the different shading. This one is an important topic. Of course, race and ethnic inequality is a big one. I will say this one ebbs and flows, right? When you have situations, such as happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, or in Louisville with Breonna Taylor, and regrettably, like more than you can name, these things flare up, and emotions certainly run high. You get protests, you get all kinds of things going on, and all kinds of stories and content consumption going around it. And so it was interesting. Here's another one where I don't think anybody would have speculated that North Dakota would have the greatest per capita interest in stories about race and ethnic inequality, but that's what the data shows. It does. And then interestingly, going back to the South, Tennessee, look at that, comparatively over indexes quite significantly compared to all of its neighboring southern states. And I will say, when you go in, I don't know the answer for this, because to answer each of these questions is its own research project. So you can go in and dive in and try to understand what's going on in Tennessee. I will say that typically what happens is something happened in Tennessee that generated a lot of news coverage, right? Or something happened in North Dakota that generated a lot of news coverage. It could have been a shooting. It could have been something else that was, around race and ethnic inequality. It generated a lot of attention. And so what you really want to do is you want to look how this ebbs and flows over a period of time. The graph or the map may look very different if I average the entire year. The entire calendar year, rather than just October 1st through a couple of days ago. It might look very different next week, and so you can shorten or lengthen your period of time, and also see how the results flow, and that matches what happens, right? I mean, things happen in the world, they get media coverage, they generate emotion, outrage, angst, things calm down, things flare up, and that happens wherever it happens and whenever it happens. So if you were to imagine creating this map across all these different topics and animating it to sort of show the pulsing colors over time, say as the election season progressed, that might be an interesting view as well. So with this kind of data, I mean, there's all kinds of analyses and insights that you can draw, and you're really limited only by the number of hours in the day. Last couple, I think I got one or two more charts here. I don't want to belabor the maps because literally I could do this all day. Violent crime is one that's another, very politicized topic, right? Law and order, violent crime, safety, security. Again, you see North Dakota, and also look at South Dakota here sort of comes into play. And again, I don't know if there were local incidents or could have been something that spanned both of them that generated a lot of interest. But also, let's go back to Illinois. Chicago is known for having a lot of crime issues. Pennsylvania, which is a very important battleground state, you see them pretty concerned. And then up there, oh goodness, is that Vermont or New Hampshire? I apologize to anybody who's offended. I can't remember which one is Vermont and which one is New Hampshire. I think that's Vermont there. I could have those backwards. But something's going on up there that, they're clearly interested in violent crime. And again, stories tend to be local. If you live in a state that's not particularly populated, and neither New Hampshire nor Vermont is particularly highly populated, and you get a significant crime story, then that's going to generate a lot of interest, probably far more so than, what it would take to generate an equivalent level of interest in New York or California or another more populous state. So again, lots of interesting things there. Immigration, of course, we know is an important topic to a lot of people, has been a topic back since 2016 and well before then, probably. Not surprisingly, you see a lot of states with a border. The border of Mexico down here, tends to be redder, right? All of these states share a border. Florida doesn't share a literal land border, but it has its own immigration issues by sea. Those all make sense to me. What I don't quite understand is what's going on in South Carolina and West Virginia. So for whatever reason, again, something has really resonated with people in South Carolina and West Virginia that's caused them to spike even more than people in Texas or New Mexico, Arizona, California on a per capita basis. So again, a very unexpected insight. And that's one of the more interesting things when you sort of hit the button and produce one of these maps with a data set. It's that moment of truth when you're like, holy cow, look at North Dakota, look at South Carolina, what's going on? And then it leads to a bunch more questions where you can really drill in and try to understand, what might be happening and what's causing that. So as I said, wow, so much data, so little time. I think that's the last of the maps I have here. But I want to leave you with a couple of the key takeaways, and then we will have some time for Q&A here. So I'll be wrapping up in just a few minutes here. So if you have any questions you want to get ready, I'm more than happy about the specific data, social media more broadly, or really anything. I'm happy to take those. So key takeaways, coronavirus matters the most by far. Everything else, at least of those Pew Research topics, was 24% compared to coronavirus is 76%. There's especially pronounced interest in coronavirus in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio. So again, 4 battleground states. You can sort of put those in the back of your mind and see as election results come in, whether that was a preliminary or a leading indicator of how those states would vote or not. Could be either way. I will also point out that what people say may, in fact, it does differ from what they do, right? We all say things, if you ask me what I'm interested in, the great works of literature, health food, and, mindfulness, right? And then how do I spend my time, or what do I consume? I'm sitting here, eating junk food and, maybe watching trash TV, hopefully not literally, but you get the idea, right? We all aspire to things and we all may say things. But when you actually look at a signal that comes from people, what they're actually doing, and again, not in a creepy, invasive, I know what Stan's reading sort of way, just in an aggregate, I know people in New York are interested in this topic. It really leads to insights and helps you understand things in a way that you might not understand just simply by doing a survey or asking people what they think about. As I've said a number of times, we'll have to find out if media consumption is a reliable indicator as to how people will vote. You might be a little skeptical. If I didn't do what I do now, I might be skeptical too. That seems like a little bit of a leap to say that, what you saw about coronavirus in Michigan and Pennsylvania is somehow going to be a leading indicator of the vote. But I'll ask a different question. If you had a voter, just sort of a voter A, I won't even give the person a gender or a name, and you knew that that person watched a lot of Fox News, or alternatively, that person watched a lot of MSNBC, do you think you might have a reliable indicator as to how that person would vote? You probably would, right? And so again, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying that media consumption is a pretty reliable indicator in a lot of ways of what people are interested in and ultimately what their either the political affiliation is or how they may choose to vote. So I think there's actually some really interesting power and potential here. So many more things we could cover. We could get to some of the non-election topics, the hearings this morning in Washington, D.C. I was talking with a number of people about those. Section 230, which is kind of an arcane section of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Not enough time here to get into that, but that's its own very interesting topic and has some pretty profound implications to how these tech platforms function. There's a lot of theories of antitrust action and how do you take big companies and break them up. If I were to cover that today, we'd have to rename the presentation "The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Boring," because antitrust is like watching paint dry. I mean, it's an arcane legal theory that takes years to unfold. So I promise I won't talk antitrust here. We'll save that for another day. If Stan wants to have an antitrust seminar, we can all maybe skip that one. Anyway, for the Q&A coming up, the virtual happy hour, happy to take questions. And I want to thank you for your time. And I'm going to call it good for here, and I'll turn it back over to Stan.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we appreciate you mapping all that out for us. It was an illuminating discussion. We did have some great questions come in throughout the talk. The first one was, how do you see esports and online games as part of the future of online marketing? Are you seeing, has that increased, throughout the quarantine and the pandemic and the attention to that?
Yeah, I can't speak to, I'm sure it must have increased in the pandemic. I haven't looked at the data, but esports has come up a lot more. A lot of the media outlets who have sports coverage have started to include esports coverage. So that's what we see, right? Okay, you publish stories about baseball, football, professional and college, and basketball and esports, right? Along with, the NHL and, whatever other sports. So I think you definitely see a rise in that. I have to believe the pandemic, which is keeping people out of stadiums, could do nothing but help the growth of esports because they weren't affected in nearly the same way as in-person sports were. And we have seen more of it. I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but it would be interesting to go back and we could do this kind of analysis to say, okay, well, let's look at esports compared to football, baseball, and basketball, right? And of course, football is going to be the most popular in the U.S. That's the most popular sports. But we could see over time how esports is closing the gap. My guess is it's still small compared to those major sports and more well-established sports. But I also think that it's almost certainly the trajectory is closing, and it's not hard to squint a little bit and see in 5 or 10 years how that gap might be significantly narrowed and maybe even flipped.
Great. That question came from our good friend Dan Roselli in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dan also runs the Venture 135 conference, and there's a special offer in the comment thread to anyone in our audience who has a startup. Dan, it's exceptionally well run, and he laid out all of the details and who it would apply to, and it's venture135.com. There's also a special offer for the Dig South Friends of Rev Tech Labs at $99 a ticket. So that's a nice plug there, Dan. And then we have a question from Adam Ring, one of our new members. Adam wants to know what percentage of the social media audience today is uncomfortable with content that is automatically tailored without the user's direct input. So, in other words, provoking a feeling of violation of privacy. It's creepy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If you ask people that way, I'd be willing to bet that probably 80% of them say, oh, I don't like that at all. But again, look at what people say versus what they do. If you give them a choice, and by the way, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I have a very strong belief, having done this professionally with the social platforms for 12 plus years. One of the reasons Facebook took off and grew so much faster than Twitter is it had an algorithmic feed, right? It may be creepy when you stop and think about it, but if you're not thinking about it, you pick up your phone, you scroll through your news feed. Before you know it, you just spent 30 minutes looking at stories, and you looked at 47 stories in your news feed because they were relevant to you, versus opening up, say your Twitter feed, which, when not algorithmically curated, is definitely current and timely, but it's a little bit like a flea market. Kara Swisher, if you follow her, she spoke at one of our conferences. She's a New York Times columnist, a tech columnist. She said Twitter is like the world's greatest library, where you walk into it and every book and periodical is just thrown randomly on the floor, right? I mean, you might find something amazing, but there's a lot of stuff to filter through. And so that's the trade-off there. You're right. It is creepy when you stop and think about it. And it may very well be creepy from a privacy perspective when you think about how much Facebook or Google, for that matter, or Amazon in a different context, know about you. But how much do you value convenience? How much do you value content you like? And our experience and observation has been that most people don't stop and think about that on a day-to-day basis. They only think about it when it's in the news or when they're asked. And then they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. I'm still going to go back and look at content that's interesting me, or shop on Amazon because it's convenient, or search on Google because I find what I want quickly.
Yeah, well, James Cage would like to know, do you think people will learn to use social media in ways that are less toxic? In other words, can we make social better by changing the culture around it?
Yeah, so I believe, if this is the same James Cage, he's one of those people who wished me birthday wishes, who I've known since college. So thank you for the question, James. I didn't know you would be in the audience, unless there's another James Cage. Can you repeat the question? I was distracted by his, it was James.
Yeah. Do you think people will learn to use social media in ways that are less toxic than currently, maybe less confrontational? Can we change the culture around us to where that's not as acceptable?
Yes, I think we can. It'll be incremental. I believe it's not going to be an overnight switch, and I do think government has a role to play there. Even Mark Zuckerberg said this morning he thinks the Communications Decency Act should be amended. And there's a lot of interesting ideas that need to be fleshed out. But one of the ideas, and just again at the risk of getting too wonky, that Section 230 is basically what gives the tech platforms immunity from liability. If you post something to Facebook and it incites violence and somebody gets hurt because of it, you're not going to have any luck, or those people are not going to have any luck going and suing Facebook for it, because Section 230 basically says, as long as they didn't know that there was a criminal act that was going to take place, and as long as they have a process to take down things that people complain about in the right way, hey, this is a copyright infringement, or this is violent, or whatever, then you can't sue them. And so that's a significant degree of protection. One of the things that's being talked about, other than just getting rid of that entirely, which I happen to think is kind of a bad idea, is, well, what if you loosen or lessen that restriction for algorithmically promoted content? So going also back to the previous question about creepiness, if algorithmically promoted content is viewed under a different legal standard than non-algorithmically promoted content, that could very much change behaviors and what you see in your news feed. And then I think, we can't put it all on the tech platforms. It's up to us too to take responsibility for the tone of the discourse that's going on social platforms, the anger that we can all be prone to, the angry things we promote, the flame wars we get in. I don't have any statistics on this because I'm sure Facebook doesn't want to talk about it, but I just have to believe right now that the rate of unfriending on Facebook is higher now than it's ever been. You think about what's going on in the midst of a really heated battle, and you just sort of see these posts from people that you just can't believe or you can't stand, and that unfriend button is just sitting there waiting for you. So yeah, those kinds of things. Ironically, I think unfriending is not really the right answer either, because all that does is sort of curate your filter bubble to include just the people who think like you. So there's a real negative side effect. Not saying anybody's individual decision's invalid. You get to decide who you want to see their content. But when you systematically unfriend people, if you find yourself doing that, then what you're doing is you're creating your own filter bubble, and you're more likely to sort of get drawn into those kinds of things. And we've seen those filter bubbles tend to escalate, emotions and behaviors in a way that's probably not very healthy.
Another friend of yours, Mike Stiles, chimed in. So Stiles would like to know, this is specific to 230. How much longer can the platforms deny that they are publishers that shouldn't have immunity, given that they exercise editorial control even if that's via an algorithm which hides and reveals certain content to certain users. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's that's a great question, and we could debate that all day. I will say, to me, it does not pass the sniff test to say that they are publishers, because they don't create the content, right? They may aggregate; they are distributors. It's a little bit like saying, going back to the 1970s, the trucks that delivered the newspapers to the newsstands or to your home, the truck drivers were publishers or media companies. No, and that's not a perfectly fair comparison, because Facebook is a lot more powerful than the truck drivers were. But they are distributors, and they do curate, right? I mean, they choose which papers to deliver to which address, and that is a form of editorial control. Although I think what they would say is that's not really editorial judgment, that's algorithmic judgment based on your behaviors. All our algorithms are doing is putting a mirror up to your behavior, and if you indicate you're interested in stories about bass fishing and kittens and Nebraska football, then you're going to get those kinds of stories. I'm not making an editorial judgment. My algorithms are giving you more of the content that you've expressed an interest in, and they would argue, I think probably successfully under the current regime, that's not an editorial decision. That's an algorithmic decision to reward or to reinforce the behavior that people have indicated that they want.
And then we have a question from Duncan Byers, another one of our members. He wanted to know if you had compared the data that we saw today back to, say, the 2018 midterm or 2016. I mean, obviously the pandemic hadn't broken out at that point. However, there are the economy, some of the other indicators, the other data points that you looked at.
Regrettably, no, and that's just simply a time and resource issue. I will say, back in 2016, we did something similar to this, and we actually we partnered with Reuters, and we were on Reuters TV on election night. And I at the time, we were doing something similar, and we had it mapped down to the electoral district in every state. And our map turned red. Don't confuse the pinkish I was showing with red or blue, but our map turned red from a Republican perspective at about noon on election day. And we're like, well, what's wrong with the data? Was the first reaction at the time. And of course, it wasn't the data; it was the results that were very surprising. We didn't do it after that because it's an enormous amount of effort and some enormous amount of data. Google has trained us all to think that you can have a little search box and get access to the world's information in 53 milliseconds. But if you think about it, they've spent millions of engineering hours optimizing and developing the infrastructure to be able to surface that. And regrettably, we don't have millions of development and engineering hours to be able to do that. So when I say there's so many things we could study in so little time, that's a great example, going back and looking at the midterms, looking at the previous election, doing longitudinal studies. But when you got 1 billion clicks a month coming through, you get 12 months of data, that's 12 billion clicks. You have 4 years. Now all of a sudden you're up to 50 billion clicks or so worth of data. You're not going to put that in an Excel spreadsheet or Tableau to chart it, right? It becomes a real engineering challenge just to manipulate that volume of data.
Understood. Well, maybe Alexa will do that for us in the future. Yeah. That volume that quickly. Well, thanks again for joining us today. You are the very first speaker, Jim, to join us for the Dig South Fall Confab. So, we're getting in the rhythm of the virtual shows and offering more content to our members. Thank you very much. We also want to, of course, thank Oracle for Startups for joining us today. They do have some special opportunities we're happy to share with you. Just email us at info@digsouth.com. That's info@digsouth.com. We're happy to share some cloud credit offers and other things to our members. Please, everyone, attend Venture 135 in Charlotte. Check the comment thread for that information. Amy Love, another good friend of ours in Atlanta, also reached out. She's a member. And Amy shares some information for startups that may be based in Atlanta or may be thinking of joining an accelerator there or checking out the scene.